anyone within its walls would invoke terrible curses from the gods. Well aware of this ancient taboo, Leonidas too chose not to storm the temple. Instead, he devised a psychological trap woven from the deepest greed and betrayal of human nature. He turned to three men who had been Agis IV's closest childhood companions, Amphares, Damocles and Achelous. To preserve their wealth and status under the new rule, the three men betrayed their old friend without hesitation. Ditching their weapons and putting on gentle smiles, they climbed the marble steps of the temple every day to visit Agis IV. They brought fresh water and spread false news of calm beyond the walls. With sincere tears and memories of their childhood, they gradually dispelled the young king's loneliness and weariness. On countless dark nights, they even accompanied Agis IV out of the temple to the public baths, before safely escorting him back. They convinced him that Leonidas too only sought power and would never dare to harm a king taking refuge in a sacred temple. Yet all this kindness and apparent safety were but preparations for the fatal blow. It was a cold, moonless night. Dark clouds hung low over the mountains of Laconia, and dense fog rose from the Eurotas River, shrouding the streets of Sparta in deathly silence. As usual, Agis IV took off his royal cloak and walked out of the temple shadows surrounded by his so-called friends toward the baths. Along the way, they talked softly about the olive trees of their youth and the innocent days gone by. A relaxed smile appeared on Agis IV's handsome face, one he had not worn for a long time. The gentle masks were brutally torn off in the dark alley, revealing the bloody fangs of cruel reality. As Agis IV and his companions stepped into a narrow torchless passage flanked by tall stone walls, Amphares suddenly spun around. The hands that had once held wooden swords with Agis IV in boyhood now clamped fiercely around his neck, slamming him hard onto the icy marble ground. Agis! Amphares' voice twisted with fear and greed in the darkness. Because of your recklessness, you must come with us to face the Ephors. Guards who had lain in ambush rushed forward. Heavy iron chains clanged loudly as they bound the young king's hands and feet. Lying on the cold ground with his hair matted in mud, Agis IV offered no resistance or curses. He simply looked calmly at his former friends, their faces a mix of shame and frenzy in the flickering torchlight. He was dragged overnight to Sparta's darkest, dampest political prison. Fearing a public uprising if the people learned the truth at dawn, Leonidas too ordered the Ephors to hold an immediate trial in the cell. Flickering torches cast grotesque shadows on the walls. The magistrates towered over the young king, demanding that he admit to betraying Sparta and express remorse for his reforms. Clad in tattered garments and pale from confinement and the sudden attack, Agis IV stood tall and unyielding. He looked steadily at his judges and spoke in his usual soft yet resolute voice, as firm as the rocks of Laconia. I need no defense for my deeds. I only followed in the footsteps of the great Lycurgus, striving to restore the lost soul of Sparta. Even facing death, my ideals are 10,000 times nobler than yours, parasites wallowing in gold and silver. These words stripped the magistrates of their last pretense of dignity. Overwhelmed by fear, they abandoned all formalities of justice and gave a ruthless order never before seen in Spartan history: carry out the execution by hanging at once, and put this native son of Sparta to death. Time seemed to slow to a crawl in the prison deep into the night, so quiet that the drip of water on cold stone could be heard clearly. An elderly executioner approached Agis IV, holding a rough hemp rope stained with old blood. The seasoned man, who had faced countless criminals, broke down the moment he saw Agis IV's face in the dim light, as pure and flawless as a god carved from Olympian marble. His hands trembled violently, and the rope slipped to the ground. He buried his face in his hands and wept bitterly. No amount of harsh rebuke or threats from the magistrates could make him raise a hand against this kind king who had given everything for the poor. Watching the weeping old man, Agis IV smiled softly and soothingly. He bent down to pick up the rope and patted the executioner's trembling shoulder, speaking in a tone as gentle as a late-night broadcast. Do not weep, my friend. I die for justice and the true soul of Sparta. It is not you or I who should fear and grieve forever, but those who have lost their conscience and sent me here. Without hesitation, he calmly looped the rope around his neck and closed his eyes gently, as if drifting off to sleep after a tiring march. The rope creaked eerily against the gallows. The brightest light of idealism in the history of Laconia was strangled to death in that unknown cell late at night. Yet Leonidas II and Amphares were not satisfied with the young king's passing. Once the monster of power tasted innocent blood, it grew ever greedier and more twisted. Heavy footsteps echoed outside the cell. Agis IV's mother Archidamia, who had waited anxiously outside the temple and even sold her last jewels to ransom her son, and his grandmother were lured into the cell under the pretense of a visit. The moment the two noble royal women stepped through the iron gate, they saw Agis IV's lifeless body hanging from the beam, his feet dangling in the cold air. The grandmother fainted on the spot. After a moment of stunned silence, Archidamia let out no screams or cries. The once immensely wealthy woman stepped forward shakily, her hands rough and stained with blood. She tenderly closed her son's eyes and straightened his rumpled clothes with great care, dressing him as neatly as if for a grand feast. Then she turned and lay down calmly beneath another empty gallows beside her son. Looking at the ferocious executioners, she spoke her final words. "May this senseless madness bring even a moment of peace to Sparta." That night, 3 of the purest souls of the Spartan royal family perished in the same cell. With bloody ropes, Leonidas II had killed the reformers and utterly destroyed Sparta's last chance of redemption. When the first faint rays of dawn filtered through the narrow iron bars of the prison and fell upon the 3 royal bodies lying side by side on the cold stone floor, an eerie silence descended across the plains of Laconia. The common people who had cheered in the squares and longed for land and freedom fell into utter despair and numbness upon hearing of Agis IV's death. They shut their wooden doors tight, tears streaming down their weathered cheeks, yet dared not step outside to plead for justice for the young martyr. Agis IV returned peacefully to the embrace of the earth. His life proved how powerless kindness and ideals could be against naked self-interest. History often delivers its most poetic and ironic echoes long after events unfold, sometimes sounded by the very enemies of the deceased. Leonidas II, who had ordered the hanging of Agis IV, died peacefully in his bed years later, believing he had stamped out the flame of idealism and emerged as a complete victor. To consolidate his power, he forced Agis IV's beautiful, wealthy widow Agiatis to marry his own son, the future king Cleomenes III. The old king thought this was a flawless political ploy. He never imagined that during countless quiet nights in Laconia, Agiatis would never reach for a poisoned dagger. Instead, with gentle restraint and tears in her voice, she told her new husband again and again about her late husband's sacred unfulfilled dreams. In the quiet hours after dark, Agis IV's ideals, long turned to dust, drifted like a ghost and took root in the blood of his enemy's son. Years later, when Cleomenes III seized power, he launched a political reform even more resolute, thorough, and radical than Agis IV's. He smashed the Senate his father had defended all his life and sent all those who had conspired to kill Agis IV to the executioner's block. The old world that Agis IV had failed to awaken with gentleness was finally overthrown by the ruthless spear of his enemy's son. Having lived merely 24 years, the young king had ultimately sown an irreversible seed of fate with his death deep in history. Night has fallen completely over the plains of Laconia. The waters of the Eurotas still flow silently through the darkness, carrying away royal lands, noble gold and the sorrowful cries from the prison cell long ago. All the political schemes, ideals, betrayals and obsessions that once troubled countless consciences have faded into faint dust drifting in the quiet night, disturbing no one's dreams. Close your eyes. Leave all sorrow and heaviness to the ancient scrolls. Rest well through this warm and peaceful night. Good night.